Right, I told you last class I wanted to come to the conclusion of Paradise Lost before moving on to Pope's own mock epic, which is a rape of the lock. But let's do that with Milton. The final few hundred lines are really all I need to look at here. And I want to begin with a little summary of what's happened in books 10 and 11 and 12, which is that God comes in book 10 to judge what has happened, visits Adam and Eve, and they find out, or rather it's revealed what he already knows, but they have themselves, they're hiding from him, as if he could hide from God, but they're hiding from him. He confronts them, they confess their sin. Then they contemplate all sorts of possible courses of action, including suicide, because they hear the terrible consequences of their actions, and to say everyone henceforward, our entire race will hate us and will regard us as our names as curses and so forth. But then Adam reminds Eve of the promise of the Redeemer, and they decide that they will go forward together, hand in hand. And having received the sort of judgment on themselves and also on the serpent now, Satan goes back down to hell. Of course, he has actually succeeded in paving the highway to hell. But he goes down to basically announce his victory, and instead he hisses like the beast, like the serpent. He no longer has the capacity for speech, and they all hiss in response, which in European, here we boo, there they hiss when they disapprove in Europe. And I don't know if that was the case in Milton's day as well, but rather than applause, he hears hissing in response to his deeds. Then the scene shifts back to the angel, Michael, telling Adam and Eve what will happen. So we get from books 11 and in 12 basically a small history of what will happen from Adam and Eve onwards up to the present day. And we'll talk about the coming of Christ, his victory over sin and death at the cross, and then the church and the passing on of doctrine and the heresies within and all that sort of thing. So that this is the consolation. This is looking forward for them. For Milton, of course, he's recounting history. For Adam and Eve, it's the future. And this is the conclusion of that which we pick up here. So I just need to set the stage a little bit. But we read in line 552, he ended. And thus Adam last replied, how soon hath thy prediction, seer blessed, measured this transient world, the race of time till time stand fixed. Beyond is all abyss. Eternity, whose end no eye can reach. Greatly instructed I shall hence depart, greatly in peace of thought, and have my fill of knowledge, what this vessel can contain, beyond which was my folly to aspire. Remember, he sought the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He sought knowledge he ought not to have had, of knowledge of good lost and evil got. That's the knowledge he gained, only the knowledge of evil, which is effectively a curse. And henceforth I learned that to obey is best, and love with fear the only God, to walk as in his presence, ever to observe his providence, and on him sole depend, merciful over all his works, with good still overcoming evil, and by small accomplishing great things, by things deemed weak subverting worldly strong, and worldly wise by simply meek. That suffering for truth's sake is fortitude to highest victory, and to the faithful death the gate of life. Taught this by his example, whom I now acknowledge my Redeemer ever blessed. So all of this is obviously Adam's response to what he's been told, but it's a summary of Milton's great epic theme. It's the reversal of the greatness of the world. It talks about, remember Satan having said that to the Beelzebub that to be weak is miserable, doing or suffering. To be weak is miserable. In Adam's summary of what he's just been taught, the small things of the world can overcome the great. That suffering for truth's sake is fortitude, the highest victory, and so forth. So he's overturning Satan's verdict, which is really the world's verdict, right? And really the grand epic tradition's verdict of Achilles and so forth, triumph through military might and physical strength, etc., and being celebrated. It's a new understanding of what constitutes epic heroism. So Milton has done what he said in Book 9 he wanted to do, which was to sing of a song that has not yet ever been sung. And thereby transforms the epic and what constitutes epic heroism, which is fidelity to God and a pattern of discipleship which really models itself after the Redeemer, which is ever blessed here. So that's in itself is interesting. And in response to that, to whom thus also the angel last replied. Having learnt, thou hast attained the sum of wisdom. Hope no higher, though all the stars thou knewest by name, and all the ethereal powers, all secrets of the deep, all nature's works, or works of God in heaven, air, earth, or sea, and all the riches of this world enjoys, and all the rule, one empire. So only add, this is one last bit, only add deeds to thy knowledge answerable. Add faith, add virtue, patience, temperance, add love, by some to come called charity, the soul of all the rest. Now this is, the greatest of these things is love, right? 1 Corinthians 13. So add these things on top of your knowledge. Do it. Don't just be hearers. Make sure that you do these things. And then he says, then wilt thou not be loath to leave this paradise, but shalt possess a paradise within thee, happier far. Again, expanding on the great themes of Paradise Lost, the great consolation here is that there is a paradise that is regained in the loss of the original paradise. So they are being, at the end of this, they're going to be compelled out of this Eden by fiery arms, the arms of fiery angels, swords barring the way to paradise through that earthly gate. But they will have a paradise within. They will have the knowledge and the deposit of the Holy Spirit within them that will give them a sense of a higher proximity to God than they ever had when he was walking in the garden. They are always with him, and he is always with them. But now there's an inner paradise, just like we saw in Satan there was an inner hell. So there's a sort of a sense in which the epic turns inwards. It's not that the external world doesn't matter at all. It's just the consolations of God are so powerful that he now no longer places them in paradise. He places paradise within them. The cost of all this is, of course, that sin and death have entered into the world. Not creations of God. God did not create sin or death. These were the consequences of man's disobedience. And, of course, they mark our life, and they mark our death, for that matter. The soul and the body are separated at death. The soul or the body leaves the soul, but the soul stays with God, or departs from God, in the sense that it no longer seeks to be in God's presence at all. It wants away from him in the same way Satan wanted nothing to do with him. He hates God. So and then he said, let us descend now, the angel does, therefore from this top of speculation, the place where they're looking down on the future. For the hour precise exacts our parting hence, and see the guards by me encamped on yonder hill, expect their motion, at whose front a flaming sword, in signal of remove, waves fiercely round. We may no longer stay. Go, waken Eve. And he does that. He wakes her up. And then and he tells her what the angel has said. And then we're going to skip to the final lines here. And she tells him that God has visited her in a dream. What the angel told him, God told her immediately inside of her head in the form of a dream. So he doesn't even need to tell her. She's heard. And this time she hasn't overheard. She wasn't hiding in the bushes while the angel speaking. God has directly spoken to her in her dreams, everything that the angel just said to Adam. And they now are leaving the paradise. Now, how is this presented? Well, it's presented in wonderful words, famous language. I will pick it up at 636. It began to parch that temperate clime. So the climate throughout the whole world at that point had been temperate. It was a fit place to live without clothes. It was warm, but it was not hot and it was not cold. But now there are going to be different places that are inhospitable to mankind. There's the Arctic and the Antarctic, which are uninhabitable, and there's also going to be a torrid zone through the middle, which they regarded in Milton's day as an impassable zone. It's so hot you can't cross it. And that's what's happening now. The heat is starting to rise, and making it so. And so began to parch that temperate climate, whereat in either hand the hastening angel caught our lingering parents, and to the eastern gate led them direct, and down the cliff as fast to the subjected plain, then disappeared. They, looking back, all the eastern side beheld of paradise, so late their happy seat, waved over by that flaming brand, the gate with dreadful faces thronged and fiery arms. Some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence their guide. They, hand in hand with wandering steps, and slow through Eden took their solitary way. Hand in hand. Remember that the hands, repeated, but now they are united together and they are going out of the presence of paradise into the land of Eden. Paradise is within Eden, by the way. So there's a paradise within Eden, and then there's the gate outside of it. In the same way in the court, which will one day be the temple, there's the Holy of Holies, and then there's the inner court, and then there's the outer court, and the same way the Garden of Eden is portrayed in Scripture. There's a place where God resides in the center of it all, which is paradise. That resides within Eden. And anyway, recent biblical scholars are suggesting that there's a strong analogy being made there, that really the Garden of Eden, and as it was created in Genesis 1-3, is actually a model of the temple. And the temple, for that matter, which is given exact instructions on how it is to be built. In the book of Hebrews, he says that the reason it is so is because it is an exact copy and representation of what is in heaven. In other words, this is in some ways God's plan. So there's a fortunate aspect to the fall here. There's obviously an evil aspect, but the fortunate aspect is God saw what would happen and he provided a better route. So this is not plan B, this is plan A. Confusing, I realize, and troubling theologically to discuss the whole idea. But that's how Milton will conclude his epic. So note, once again, the idea of an internal paradise as well as an external paradise. An internal hell as well as an external hell. The one is a recompense for the other, and it's better than the other, or worse than the other. Because remember, for Satan, worse than being in hell was not being in hell. Because then he knew that, and it tormented him even more to be in the midst of a good place. He didn't want to be there. It caused him enormous pain to be in anything that suggested the goodness of God. That differentiation. So then it comes into all sorts of theological questions. What does it mean to live? Because it's a living God and all that. It means to be in relationship with him and present with him, etc. And to be in hell is to be in no relationship, to be totally absent from him, to some degree have nothing of God and no good. And to wish it. so C.S. Lewis presents this in his Great Divorce as people being offered salvation and not wanting it. Anyway, but we'll come to that at another stage. I'm going to comments or questions before I move on to Pope's rape of the lock. Yes?
Last class you mentioned how you were going to post.
Okay, so not related to this, but related to that. Yes? Okay, good. I will